Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Leslie begins consolidating her standing by quietly, ruthlessly folding money into the right place at the right time, the Fairmont Crest Country Club, and that the move will change the social geometry of the enclave forever. Leslie does not arrive at the country club like a woman with something to prove. She arrives like someone with everything to buy. She wears a nondescript coat that hides more cash than the club's safe and carries herself with the practiced calm of someone who has already run the calculus a dozen times. Leverage is quiet until it is not. The president of the club, a man who has spent 30 years balancing egos and ledgers, invites her into his office because the club has always made space for generosity and because, under the marble, the club's accounts have always had holes that nice checks can fill. Leslie's check is not meant to be noticed, it is meant to be felt, like a current that changes the course of everyone swimming in the pool. She does not hand over a single legalistic donation. There is a pause, a breath pulled by two people who understand social currency. Leslie speaks in a way that shoulders cannot help but lean inward. She offers an endowment, a sum large enough to underwrite a wing of the club, to pay for landscaping and tournaments, and for the kind of hospitality that transforms memberships into legacies. She speaks of scholarships for junior members, of a wellness initiative, of naming rights. It is all phrased in the language of service, but the undertow is clear. This will be Leslie's name on a plaque, her last name on an invitation, her face at every ribbon cutting for years to come. The president, careful and not unambitious, nods. He imagines the polished plaques, the glamour of press photos, the infusion of cash. He imagines the board, some of whom are aging into conservatism and fear, and some of whom are hungry for relevance. The board, particularly the members who read the minutes and the balance sheet and the gossip column, will be easy to persuade when the ledger tilts in their favor. Leslie's money lands like a tidal wave inside a bathtub full of floating chips. It rearranges everything. Anita and Nicole watch the scene from a distance, expecting the justice they think they've engineered. For weeks they have plotted to remove Leslie's membership. She has been in there telling an embarrassment, a loose thread that might pull the whole sweater apart. Nicole has felt the satisfaction of moral rightness before. The thrill of a phone call that undoes a social threat, the small, tight pleasure of seeing a rival's card revoked. It is a ritual she has practiced: ostracize, correct, preserve the image of the Dupree household as pristine and untroubled. Anita, older and more dangerous in the way only history can make a woman, smiles the way matriarchs smile when they sense the tide turning toward family safety. They imagine Leslie's face when she receives the news, the momentary flicker of shame and defeat. Nicole envisions a scene in which Leslie flees the grounds like a hound with its tail tucked. In Nicole's mind, the country club is a kiln that will bake Leslie's arrogance into dust. But Leslie does not leave. She sits at the main table that evening and watches as Anita and Nicole's assumptions crumble in slow motion. They have orchestrated the cancellation. The president has relayed the board's unanimous decision, or at least that's what they think, and the timing is perfect. A gala, a small gathering meant to toast the club's revitalization, where the Duprees will be seen as guardians of propriety. What Leslie does next is surgical. She orders a glass of champagne, listens for Nicole's laughter, and when Nicole's eyes dart toward her with that smug satisfaction, Leslie raises her glass, not in retreat, but in ownership. When the president offers the couple of nervous apologies reserved for social miscalculations, Leslie smiles and mentions the endowment she has just committed. The effect is immediate and brutal. Anita's smile freezes into something she does not want the rest of the room to see, confusion folding into the cold ink of anger. Nicole's face drains. The board that had been so very eager to expel her now leans in, grateful for the cosmetic and the operating capital. The club's tiny hierarchies tilt, and the condition that had been Leslie's removal becomes a footnote in the meeting minutes as the club welcomes its newest benefactor. Leslie's victory is small and public, and she knows the value of both. She is not merely buying herself back into the club, she is buying herself forward into a new kind of presence, the donor everyone thanks in public and cannot refuse in private. She becomes a VIP because she has made herself a necessity. Leslie Thomas Athletic Pavilion appears in a press release the following morning. and the name curls into the society pages like a rumor that is also a command. Nicole's fury is not private. It becomes theater. Nicole, who has spent a life navigating the soft but implacable rules of status, takes the humiliation personally. Leslie could have left it at the donation and the naming rights, but she chooses to amplify. She invites Anita and Nicole to a private unveiling of the athletic facility. She makes a point of telling Nicole in a voice that is as sweet as a varnish that she should say my name when you come in, as if speaking Leslie's name will unlock some secret favor at the front desk. The phrase is small, ridiculous, but it lands like a salt on a newly scabbed wound. The taunt is cruelly efficient. The gift of naming becomes a taunt. The building is a monument not to community but to personal victory. Leslie's eyes flick to Nicole as she speaks, and there is a flash of something almost animal there, the glee of a person who had been pushed aside and has now returned as the person who dictates who gets through the door. Leslie's manners are impeccable. Her voice, like money, is smooth and decisive. She hands Nicole, with a small theatricality, a tight head's tie folded and perfect. Nicole's fingers close around it like a trigger being cocked. Nicole will not be the only one to register the weight of that tie. Ted's ties are a kind of signature, the soft Italian silk he favors, the etiquette of knot and pattern. To imagine him having lent, or lost, or been wrapped in a situation that led to Leslie possessing his tie is to imagine a breach. When Nicole finds the tie later, the knot opens a string of questions that will not easily be stopped. Suspicion is an accelerant in a world running on reputations. Underneath the surface of the country club subplot there is a quieter, more corrosive movement. Eva, younger, fierce, and still groping for a moral map, is suffering in the aftermath of things she cannot entirely control. She has learned that her mother is Leslie, or at least that is the line of whisper that cuts through the corridors of Fairmont Crest. The narrative the soaps like to feed us doubles back on itself. A woman who used to be invisible now insists she belongs at the table, and the past is a kind of ledger she intends to settle. Eva's moral center, when it is ruptured, lashes out at those she believes to have lied to her. The target here is Ted. She is hurt because the man who professed disgust for her mother for Leslie has been intimate with Leslie in a way that feels like betrayal. She expects clarity, a clean line between right and wrong, but what she finds is a messy tangle of confession and deflection. Ted, called to account in a kitchen late at night, confesses at last, not in a tone of defiance but of embarrassment, that his lapse with Leslie was not a moment of dignity but a loss of control. He says the words because they are the only ones that make sense in the silence. I let her use me. Ted's admission does not exonerate him. It complicates everything. He explains a private conversation that promised discretion and then did not deliver. He admits that Leslie threatened him with exposure and that he paid the price. The neat borders Eva wanted to draw around blame evaporate. She sees the man she thought was steady now small and ashamed in front of her. His shame is a commodity, a human currency that Leslie knows how to collect. Leslie's relationship with secrets is not an accident. It is craft. Where she cannot outright own the narrative by buying the property or the plaque, she buys leverage in information. She has cultivated ways to make people indebted to her not only with cash but with secrets they do not want aired. That is the most dangerous currency in Fairmont Crest, the knowledge that you have wronged someone you cannot afford to anger, and that someone else. Leslie holds the ledger. The idea that this war between Leslie and the Duprees will be a simple exchange of polite insults misunderstands the physics of the community. Money rearranges invitations and placards, but secrets burn bridges. Leslie's donations are stagecraft. Her true weapon is the indignity she can inflict in private. She knows the architecture of humiliation. It is quieter and more clinical than gossip, and it threatens to dismantle alliances at the speed of a rumor with documentation attached. When Nicole realizes that Leslie has not merely returned but has become a power center, the small outrages cannot be contained. She begins plotting with Anita in the way a general might plan a flank, quietly, meticulously, with an understanding that brute force, a public confrontation, will only feed Leslie's narrative of persecution. Anita, who learned long ago to think in generations rather than headlines, counsels a slower, more deliberate approach. She cannot afford to be consumed by public fury. She must preserve the family's image while also excising the threat without handing Leslie an opportunity to claim martyrdom. That is where Vernon's apparatus becomes relevant, not because he enjoys the hunt, but because Vernon understands the politics of power better than most. He knows that the Dupree name can be leveraged, and more importantly, he has resources outside the club's cocktail glasses, an ally network, long-standing connections in the county, a moral and legal authority that knows how to ask the right questions. Vernon is less reactive than Anita and less performative than Nicole. He begins to quietly mobilize an inquiry not into the charitable gift but into Leslie herself. It is the kind of investigation that does not announce itself to the society pages. It starts with a phone call, a careful request, a lawyer who asks for permission to look at public records. Vernon's team finds small anomalies. A lease that has been scrubbed, a bankruptcy petition with missing pages, a name change buried in an old municipal filing. He does not yet have the smoking gun, the kind of concrete proof that will lead to criminal charges, but he has enough to justify further digging. His instinct is that every scandal contains a pattern. Patterns are the language he understands. He asks for timelines, financial flows, the people who have had interactions with Leslie across counties. In the quiet of their library, a man who has been a public servant for decades pores over spreadsheets with the grim patience of someone knitting a noose. Leslie, of course, anticipates this. People like her always have a contingency plan. She will not be surprised to find Vernon poking around. She has padded ledgers, shell corporations, and plausible deniability that can withstand casual scrutiny. She also has the capacity for preemptive strikes. Privately, she begins to seed rumors of her own, suggestive gestures and half-truths about the Dupree household's own skeletons. The art of retaliation in this social milieu is not blunt, it is surgical. She whispers about an old incident, about an accident that no one wanted to discuss, about a girl named Laura whose misfortune once brushed close to the Dupree family and then disappeared into the margin notes of society columns. Leslie does not yet broadcast accusations, she implants them, like a pathogen waiting for fever. That whisper about Laura, a name Vernon hears circulated among the people he calls, becomes a vector. Was there a Laura whose life intersected with Leslie in a way that could be weaponized? The question animates Vernon. He calls a private investigator, an old friend who owes him favors and whose talent is turning memory into evidence. The investigator moves through neighborhoods collecting chatter, reading old files and scanning social media timelines for comments that, at the time, seemed idle but are now threads to be pulled. Anita, meanwhile, she confronts her daughters with a maternal intensity that feels like a verdict. She reminds Nicole and Danny and the entire household that reputation is not only about optics but about the emotional architecture that holds the family together. She is furious that Leslie has inserted herself into their lives, yes, but she is more afraid of the cascade effect, of marriages strained, of trust dissolving in the face of blackmail, of family legacies reduced to tabloid fodder. There is a scene late at night in the Dupree study where the family draws up a list of contingencies. They are methodical, pragmatic. They plan public relations moves, legal threats, and charitable counters, an initiative at the Dupree Foundation that will absorb some of the community's attention and steer donations to causes that make Leslie's gestures look less central. But beneath that managerial planning, there is terror. Every item on the list is a possibility that acknowledges the fragility of their world. Anita looks at her husband Vernon and for a long moment they do not speak. They have done the work of building a dynasty, and now they must become siege architects. The private conversation is heavy with a single thought: power looks noble until someone else chooses how to spend it. While the Duprees marshal their resources, Leslie's next moves are not only strategic, they are theatrical. She wants the Duprees to feel the sting not just of exclusion but of personal betrayal. She arranges for small, intimate affronts: a parking space in front of the pavilion reserved for Leslie's guests, a framed photograph of her smiling with the club's dignitaries hung prominently in the members' hallway. She ensures that when Nicole enters, her name is not on the list she had once thought final. Leslie whispers a story about dead at another social dinner, and the rumor travels to a table where wives sip white wine and husbands misinterpret silence as consent. Ted, in the center of this, becomes a pivot of both regret and strategic relevance. He has always been the kind of man who values appearance, the suit that fits just so, a laugh that sounds untroubled. But when Leslie's kindness and menace intersect, he emerges as less a figure of quiet strength than a man who has been used. His private humiliation, the knowledge that he had been intimate with Leslie and had thought himself in control of the narrative, becomes publicized not through tabloids but through the small, precise hands of those who will reframe his conduct as part of Leslie's larger scheme. Ted must answer to Nicole in ways he has not before. The tension between them is a domestic battlefield where every small look has charge. Nicole is shrewd in her fury. She knows that moral superiority is not a shield if it is perceived as brittle. She needs him to offer not cheap contrition but action, explain, apologize, and remove himself from the orbit that allowed Leslie to wriggle in. Ted's embarrassment turns inward. He cannot undo what has been done, but he can change the shape of the aftermath. In the peculiarly public-private world of Fairmont Crest, that is a long climb. Leslie, however, watches all of this with a composer's delight. She sets the tempo and waits to see who will follow and who will stumble. The idea that she might push Ted entirely from Nicole's household, that she could orchestrate a rupture that would accelerate divisions inside the Dupree house, is not far from her aim. Yet even as she toys with these possibilities, she must weigh the risks. There is a balance between exacting revenge and creating a martyr. The bigger the humiliation Leslie stages, the more likely she is to finally draw the attention of a man like Vernon, whose anger does not merely make noise but mobilizes forces. That is why, when the private investigators surfaces a small, troubling connection, a creased photograph, a police document with an unsent letter, Vernon zeroes in. The next chapters of the fight will not be fought in press releases but in depositions and security camera footage, in old hospital logs and the redacted margins of municipal records. Vernon knows that to bring someone like Leslie to account, they will need something more than rumors. They will need a pattern of behavior that connects to a harm. The investigator's tip about Laura is the kind of bone a determined man will gnaw on until he finds marrow. What the Duprees cannot yet know, and what Leslie does, is the shape of that past. Leslie's history with Laura, whether it is an accident, an omission, or a carried secret, could be the fulcrum. The prospect that Vernon might find evidence where none had been thought to exist sets a new pressure on Leslie. Preempt or perish. She begins to reach into her toolbox to ensure that fear is not the only instrument she wields. She will also deploy a loyalty, false friends, and the occasional, surgical confession that keeps adversaries off balance. She thinks 10 moves ahead, not because she loves the game but because she understands the stakes. In Fairmont Crest, every misstep becomes a headline and every headline becomes an invitation to upheaval. The result is a slow-motion collision course. Leslie is tightening her grip at the club even as she fans embers into flames elsewhere. Anita and Nicole try to act with prudence, but anger is a fickle advisor and occasion sometimes demands a fiercer hand. Vernon prepares legal probes and calls in favors. He is a man who believes in systems, in the slow, durable pressure of documentation. Ted is left to reckon with his mistakes in ways that feel both intimate and theatrical. Eva, caught between loyalty to her mother and an allegiance to truth, stands on a precipice, wounded by both the knowledge and the exploitation of what she's been told. The community itself begins to feel like a ship with too many captains, the Duprees, with their history and influence, Leslie, with her wealth and willingness to spend, and the club, which once served as a neutral ground, now a ballroom of competing interests. Each party lines their operatives in whispers and glances. The small betrayals, a call returned late, a text message never answered, a donation redirected, begin to rearrange social alliances. Even those who claim to be uninterested in the conflict find themselves choosing sides, because in a place built on appearances, alliances are the oxygen that keeps reputations alive. As the days pass, The specter of Laura hangs like an unopened letter in Vernon's desk. His investigator returns with a set of photographs and 2 witness statements that resemble a frightened chorus. There is a woman who remembers a car that night, another who recalls a rumor passed along in a barber shop. The evidence is messy, imperfect, and human. But it is enough for Vernon to know that Leslie's history may not be as clean as she publicly insists. He does what he has always done. He calls lawyers and schedules meetings that will not be advertised. He will not, in public, make accusations until he has something that can survive scrutiny. He has learned that patience in a law office is often mightier than anger on a porch. Leslie senses the net closing incrementally. She feels it as a change in temperature. The friends who once took her calls now hesitate. The club's board chairwoman returns a reply slower than before. She is not reckless. She has learned how to buy time as efficiently as she buys influence. She sends her own emissaries, a press release celebrating the pavilion's impact on youth sports, a photo of herself cutting a ribbon with children smiling in the background. She frames herself as benefactor and protector. She smiles in front of cameras and then closes the door to write a list of names she knows are vulnerable. Inside the Dupree house, the family's cohesion shows both cracks and the deftness of repair. Nicole, wounded and furious, rehearses speeches that are both pointed and diplomatic. She will not give Leslie the theater of a catfight. She wants something more measured, more definitive. She crafts a plan to expose the donations' legal minutiae to show that Leslie's money cannot wash away the fact of her manipulations. Anita, who has seen the long arc of public life, leans into resilience. She reaches out to old colleagues, to friends she trusts, and reminds the family that dignity is a matter of memory as much as headline. The tension escalates not because of brute force but because of choreography. Each character plays a role defined by history and fear. Leslie's moves are the most audacious. She uses charity as both shield and spear. She weaponizes intimacy. She names a pavilion in her own honor and smiles while the house of cards trembles. The Duprees respond with a set of countermeasures that are careful and patient, leaning on law and reputation. Ted, meanwhile, attempts a private form of reparations, which might or might not satisfy the public demands levied against him. As the stakes rise, so does the question that will not go away: what is the cost of winning? Leslie imagines a life in which the Duprees bend to her will, where the town accepts her narrative because it cannot help but accept the shimmer of philanthropy. Anita imagines protecting a legacy that has taken decades to build. Vernon imagines a courtroom. Nicole imagines a broken marriage mended, or not, but above all she imagines dignity maintained. Eva imagines a mother and a truth reconciled in a way that will not leave her the debris of other people's revenge. None of these imaginations are neat. The war Leslie has begun is not one of mere social standing. It is a fight over the moral grammar of Fairmont Crest. It is a lesson being learned in real time. Money can buy space, but it cannot, by itself, purchase innocence. And secrets, once placed in the wrong hands, become leverages that reshape lives. The hours fold into weeks. The pavilion opens with a crowd and a ribbon. The local paper runs a photo of Leslie smiling and surrounded by children, a caption that reads, "Generosity brings new life to Fairmont Crest." Vernon reads it with his jaw clenched. Nicole looks at the photograph and sees the placement of Leslie's hand on a child's shoulder and imagines the roster of grudges that will now be immortalized. There is, in the audience, applause and disquiet, the polite noises of a community that is both impressed and wary. And somewhere between the club's hum and the hush of the Duprees' legal consultations, the tiny, cold fact sits like a seed, a tie folded on a shelf, a question that will not be answered by ribbon cuttings. The inquiry into Laura is ongoing. The investigator calls with a name, a date, a whisper that promises to be more than rumor. Vernon answers and, on the line, hears details that will force the family to move from the ballroom into the courtroom of memory. Leslie's smile never falters in public. She knows that the greatest victories are those that keep you smiling as the world rearranges around you. But the nights unwind differently. She writes lists. She pays for services invisible to society, columns but vital to control, surveillance, the preservation of digital histories. The quiet purchase of loyalty. She prepares contingencies for the possibility that Vernon will have the evidence to force the light into places she thought were dark and safe. The battle is no longer merely about club membership. It is about who gets to define what it means to belong in Fairmont Crest and who will decide which pasts are forgiven and which are prosecuted. Each move is deliberate, a stroke on a chessboard. The flicker of that tight headstay remains a small, ominous symbol, the way a single thread might reveal the seam of a garment. For now, those inside the house wait, strategize, and brace themselves. The stakes are simple and complex at once: a woman's reputation, a family's legacy, a town's moral calculus. And in the middle of it all is Leslie, smiling into cameras, tightening the screws, and waiting to see whether her next move will be the last anyone remembers or the beginning of something that will change everything.